Ann Fox asked me to come and talk to you for a few minutes about assisted suicide. It's an issue that's been with us quite a while. Oregon passed the first law in 1994 allowing for terminally ill patients to make a request for overdose of barbiturates to kill themselves if they are terminally ill. Just repeat the request in 2 weeks and you get this prescription for lethal pills. You know, take 100 of these, you won't have to call me in the morning. Since then, Washington, California, Vermont, and Colorado have passed similar laws, and also the District of Columbia. So right here where we are now. And it is going to be a federal issue. It has been a federal issue before. 20 years ago, Congress passed the Assisted Suicide Funding Restriction Act, saying that no matter what a state does, no federal health program, no federal hospital, whether it's Indian Health Service or VA or Medicaid and Medicare, is going to be associated with helping to kill people directly, warn people, or to assist them in killing themselves. Senators Kennedy and Kerry voted for that. It was almost unanimous in Congress. There may be an effort to reaffirm that commitment now, 20 years later, including getting Democrats again on board for saying that with the Republicans. And you'll probably be hearing about that. Right now, the appropriations bill that everybody is talking about to keep the government funded has language in it to nullify, to negate the DC assisted suicide law. We don't know whether that's going to be kept in or negotiated out. Everybody's talking about, immigration as the key issue that divides the parties right now. This is an issue. I'm really happy to see young folks here, and I have a message for you. You're here because your parents gave you life and gave you care and have taken care of you throughout your whole lives. And I want to tell you that when you get older, it's payback time, and you get to protect your parents from this when people are trying to railroad them. A lot of people think assisted suicide is a harder issue to argue than abortion. Abortion is just so clear to us. This is, an intervention to kill an innocent, helpless baby who never asked to die, who wants to live, by other people, and it's an act of violence. We can see the graphic violence of it in a number of ways. And here you have the argument that, well, these are people who are telling you themselves, this is my free choice, I want to control my body, there's no hope for me anyway, and I just want to have a painless end to my life, and this is going to be very humane and dignified. So I want to just review that claim. The argument for this in a capsule is the very title of the organization that promotes it nationwide, which calls itself Compassionate Choices. They used to be called the Hemlock Society, but somebody eventually told them that being associated with the execution of Greek philosophers like Socrates is probably not the best way to sell your product, and so they call themselves Compassionate Choices. Is this about the patient's choice? The first thing to know is that, and the psychologists all agree that in multiple studies on this, choices for suicide are generally not based on anything you could call an autonomous or rational choice. It's based on depression and other mental disturbances. And that is as much true among people who are seriously ill as among the able-bodied. If you have depression, a lot of different stressors can tip you over into feeling like you might want to do away with yourself. And those can be from loss of job or financial problems or a lost love, rejection by others, to physical mental illness. But it's all the same thing. It's a choice that we as a society have said we are going to prevent people from acting on. We're going to talk them off the ledges. We're going to take the gun or the bottle of pills away from them and say, let's talk about this, you need help, you need counseling. So what you have here is one class of people for whom the response to the same request is exactly the opposite. They're going to get suicide prevention you're going to get suicide assistance. Not because you're making this choice. All of these people were trying to make that choice, but because we have a different view of you and the value of your life. And at that point, we begin to see that this really is about other people's choices, about whether you have a life worth living, the remaining part of your life. There are a lot of people in this process, the way Oregon and the other states have set this up, who have a lot more control of the choices than the patient does. And the patient makes a request. The most powerful and individual in this situation is the doctor. The doctor gets to choose whether to call this person terminally ill. The doctor gets to choose whether to call this patient competent and making a voluntary choice. The doctor chooses whether to order a psychological evaluation to see if the patient might have some depression or other thing that's influencing their choice. 96% of the cases, there is no such evaluation. Only 4% even get to see a psychologist. And the doctor gets to choose the second doctor, his golf buddy or whatever, who gets to give the second opinion, which he'll probably be pretty confident will share his opinion on whether all these things are true. The witnesses, according to the Oregon law, you get 2 witnesses to the written request. One of them can actually be the heir and stands to inherit from your estate if you die. The other one can be, if you're in an assisted living or a long-term care facility, one of the witnesses is actually required to be an employee of that facility, a facility that may have its own vested interest in getting expensive or difficult patients off the books. And the most powerful person of all is the person, whoever it is, who is left alone with the patient at the end when the decision whether to take the drugs is taken. And you can be pretty sure, since this patient is pretty sick, that that person is physically more powerful than the patient himself. The amazing thing is that when people get the prescription, Compassionate Choices often says, well, that's just to have that as an option. It doesn't mean they're deciding to die. It just means they're comforted by having the choice. The real decision comes later when they decide whether to take them. If that is, it's the patient who decides that. We don't know, because it's a private thing in their own home most often. But that means that the most important time to prevent coercion, to check for competency, to check for voluntariness on the part of the patient, to make sure nobody is forcing them into this, is the time when they take the pills. And at that time, there's absolutely no assessment of any of those things. They say it's so important to test for all these things, and then they say when the decision's actually made, none of them are done. The doctor doesn't know. 90% of the time, the doctor who prescribed is not even there. But oddly enough, that doctor who is not there is the only one who can report on what happened. Nobody else is allowed to scrutinize that and question it. The doctor who prescribed the lethal drugs can fill out the death certificate, and the law tells him, falsify the cause of death. He's required to. It is illegal to tell the truth on a death certificate in Oregon and Washington. In other words, you have to list the underlying illness, not the lethal drugs, as the actual cause of death. Why? To prevent scrutiny, to prevent an autopsy that might tell people something went very different from what the doctor says. The Oregon Health Department itself once said a year and a half after the law first went into effect, they said all this. The doctor is the only one who files the report. We have to take the report at face value. And they said, quote, the whole account could be a cock and bull story. But they have no authority, no resources to question that. So who has the choice? Well, lots of people who are not the patient. The patient's actually the most vulnerable person, the most impressionable person in the situation. Is this about compassion? For people who are imminently dying, who have no other hope, no treatment that could reverse their condition, and it's going to be, painless and humane. With regard to the terminal illness thing, there's something came out very recently, in January, from a Swedish investigator named Fabian Stahl. And I encourage you to look up his name and find his report. It's Fabian, like F-A-B-I-A-N. Those of us who are really old remember a singer in the 60s with that name. Stahl is S-T-A-H-L-E. In Sweden, they've begun to talk about having a law like Oregon's. He said, yeah, it's only for people who are going to die in 6 months. And then he read something in the report of the Swedish Council of Medical Ethics that said, that's 6 months without treatment. So that's very different from what I thought that took. I wonder if that's what the Oregon law means. So he wrote a series of emails to the Oregon Health Division, and he asked them, and their staff gave very candid answers. And what they said was, no, this is somebody who's expected they would die in 6 months if they are not treated. There could be a cure. There could be things that are done that could help them live for decades. But if the patient refuses that treatment, or if other people withhold it from them, the doctor says, no, I'm not going to do that. You can't find a doctor who's willing to treat him. Or his insurance company says, we won't pay for that, it's too expensive. We'd rather pay for a lethal overdose of drugs, which is really cheap. Then he's terminal. You are terminal if they can make you terminal by refusing you the things that can cure you. Every diabetic now is terminal because if you refuse them their insulin, they'll die in days or weeks. So the whole restrictions to people who are imminently dying no matter what is an illusion. It was a deception from the outset. They mean that just people who need some treatment to survive, if you can deny them that or refuse to pay for it, refuse to provide it, then they become eligible to get finished off with these drugs. And it's interesting in that context to find that according to Oregon's own report, 70% of the patients who are taking these drugs have no insurance or only governmental insurance. And in Oregon, the government health insurance is a healthcare rationing plan that cuts off reimbursement for treatments that can prolong life at a certain point. But always, there's a list. If you go further down the list, the state budget is this, then it gets cut off after that point. But assisted suicide is always very high on the list. It's always cheap enough to fund. Is it about the need to relieve intolerable pain? Well, it turns out only about a third of the patients that are doing this cite pain or even fear of future pain as a factor. They cite things like feeling like I'm a burden on others, feeling like I've lost the ability to do the everyday activities that make my life enjoyable. You know who else says things like that? Is people who have just been injured and get a disabling injury. A lot of you've probably heard these stories of Michael J. Fox when he got Parkinson's, Christopher Reeve when he fell off his horse and got paralyzed, and people who were first diagnosed with a terminal illness can feel that way. They can feel hopeless. It takes them a while. It takes them a few weeks, sometimes a couple of months, with the help of others to get over that feeling of hopelessness and adjust to the life they now have, where they can't do so many of those other things, but still can find things that make life worth living, make life meaningful. And so what this does is it says to those folks, go ahead, all we have to do is make you feel, you can feel depressed about this stress for 2 weeks and then you're gone. So it's not about unrelieved pain. In fact, there's evidence, I've documented a bunch of it in an article I think is on Massachusetts Citizens for Life website that I did for the Charlotte Lozier Institute that shows that in the states that have legalized this, support for pain control and palliative care or its implementation actually suffers. That fewer hospices open than in states that didn't legalize this. There's less pain control and there's more unrelieved pain among the people who are not killing themselves because you've sucked the incentive out of the medical profession for really caring for people's real problems. You've given them a quick fix that ends all problems by ending the patient. So why should they even learn how to do this or commit themselves to the hard work of really doing palliative care? So it increases pain overall. The one thing it also increases is suicides. Standard, ordinary, garden variety suicides. Oregon, of course, has had a law in place for 23 years. Its suicide rate, not counting the physician-assisted suicides, which by state law you're not allowed to count as suicide. The suicide rate in Oregon is 42% higher than the national average. It's higher than average in Washington State as well. Been studies about the effect of legalization there and in other countries as well. And the reality is what we're doing is teaching a whole generation of people, young people, older people, people who are temporarily depressed or despairing, that the society and the law have decreed that suicide is a solution to some people's problems. And they internalize that, they take that in. There are guidelines from the World Health Organization and also from Department of Health and Human Services here and mental health experts in the United States, a set of guidelines for news media about reporting on suicides, so that when you report on someone taking their own life, you do not encourage other people to mimic that or to have copycat suicides. It's called the Werther effect, after a novel that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote, The Young Werther, where Werther is this man who's despairing because he's been rejected by the woman he loves, and he kills himself. And people were appalled that in Europe, everybody who's reading this novel was killing themselves. They were, this gave them the idea. So the first guideline from the World Health Organization and all these experts is, do not glorify suicide and do not report it as a solution to a problem, which is exactly what Compassionate Choices does in all of its time. So in short, this is very like other kinds of killing of the innocent. It is not free, it is not compassionate, and its victims are far more numerous than the people who actually use it, because it spreads a toxic idea throughout our society. We need to be as committed against this as against abortion and other forms of killing. Thank you so very much.